Hey, I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
A fellow voluntarist, well, this video is not going to be that bad that, Ooh. So, this is the Radical Reviewer, another one of those thought slime-esque Marxist content creators who LARPs as an anarchist and flimsily attempts to justify his political ideas by spreading incomplete or irrational philosophical arguments while backing them up with fallacious reasoning and spreading equally absurd economic sophisms. Though he occasionally makes video responses or essays on philosophical concepts like the video we're watching today, he usually does book reviews, which can partially explain why he hasn't really been able to get anywhere despite YouTube starting to promote so-called leftist content creators and their algorithms since July of 2018, and why a good half of his videos barely have more than 100 views, because there is nothing Marxists hate more than reading. But since he's one of the ones who actually does read the literature he promotes the ideas of, certainly that should mean he's more rational, right? Well, in my experience, the ones who are well-read tend to be the most slimy and disingenuous out of all of them, and from what I've seen of this guy so far, he's no exception. For instance, in his video titled Stefan Molyneux Doesn't Understand Anarchism, he unironically attempts to argue that Marxist philosophy does not argue for materialistic egalitarianism.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And it's not, and a lot of times you'll hear people on the left use the term fairness, right? Like, this is what Obama used to love, say people need to pay their fair share. And it's look, the truth is that life is never completely fair.
Now, these arguments have been widely debunked, from Cuck Philosophy's video, Why Equality is Unhelpful as a Political Goal, to Anarcho-Pact's video, Marx and Engels Were Not Egalitarians. And even I argued this point in my review of the book Pericon.
Which is so fucking ridiculous, I had to actually listen to that multiple times just to make sure that I'd heard what he was attempting to argue correctly, since literally the entire premise of the Marxist philosophy is that everything should be owned in common, and what they refer to as capitalism causes people with different amounts of wealth to work against one another for their own group's interests, or the concept they refer to as class struggle, which they view as being unethical. Of course, this is complete nonsense. People are individuals and only represent their own individual interests, and common ownership doesn't exist. But that's not the point. You don't even need to finish the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto in order for this to become self-evident, so denying the positivist egalitarian nature of Marxism is tantamount to denying the religious nature of Christianity. For someone who fancies themselves a leftist book reviewer, not reading Marx is inexcusable, so he can't use that as an excuse, and he only attempted to make this point in response to Molyneux making a decent argument against Marxism's ethical principles, so I presume this was just a contrarian attempt to gaslight and try to weasel his way out of having to address an argument he doesn't have a rebuttal to. That's the level of absolute argumentative turpitude we're dealing with here. Someone who will toss out the entire fundamental basics of his own or any philosophy he's attempting to defend just to try and claim his opponent is wrong when they've made a perfectly valid argument, and will go back to defending the position from the very premise which they've just claimed it doesn't represent only moments later. I actually somewhat feel bad for people who watch content creators that'll pull shit like this, because he does this in the vain hope that his audience isn't able to critically think about what he's suggesting. He basically thinks his audience is stupid, and he may or may not be wrong, but just imagine enjoying the opinion of someone who thinks so low of you like this. Well, at least the people who aren't able to see through the inconsistencies of his arguments aren't aware that he must think this way, since in order to be aware they would have to be able to understand how what he's saying is logically or philosophically inconsistent. Anyway, on to this abortion of a video.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer, taking a look at capitalism and the non-aggression principle. The non-aggression principle, or nAP, is defined as an ethical stance asserting that aggression is inherently wrong. In this context, Aggression is defined as initiating or threatening any forcible interference with an individual or individual's property. Capitalism is defined as an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. Characteristics central to capitalism include private property, capital accumulation, wage labor, voluntary exchange, a price system, and competitive markets.
Wikipedia's explanation of the non-aggression principle is a bit basic, but accurate to where the only points of contention I or anyone else could have with it ride on the thin line between semantics and nitpicking, so I won't go into detail. But if you've seen my clickbaity as fuck video titled Why Libertarians Should Reject Capitalism, this is a great example of precisely why the term shouldn't be used in debates, especially when describing the market system in a voluntarist society. The term capitalism is a purely political one used to describe an economic system and consequently has a different meaning to each different person depending on their ideology and conceptualization of how markets and economies work. Discussion of the subject therefore is made impossible because in order to even begin, you'd have to define 1,000,001 different concepts following up to discussing the idea itself. In the context of a voluntarist society, which is obviously being implied by the association of capitalism to the non-aggression principle, private property is simply anything which individuals have had come into their possession as a result of their own agency or by voluntarily associating with someone else. And because each individual chooses to use whatever property they have in whichever way benefits them the most, since each individual has different values associated with different properties or different means of operating them, applying Wikipedia's description of capitalism, or any description of capitalism for that matter, onto a broader voluntarist society is impossible, since in a voluntarist society there is no centralized organization using coercive means to manipulate markets and attempt to engineer social structures around one means of organizing. So everyone can legally associate in any way two or more people mutually agree upon as long as everyone in this exchange is acting in accordance to their own agency, so no one is being coerced into this association. The point is that money and wealth are not the same thing because different people value different things. So capital accumulation is a form of profit, sure, but capital accumulation is not the only conceived of manner under which one profits in a stateless free market, and there is no state instituting economic policy plans, so according to at least this description of capitalism, it would be inaccurate to use this in order to describe associations within an individualist anarchist society. Not to mention that this article seems to be suggesting that the only people profiting are those operating a quote-unquote means of production, so people selling their own labor voluntarily and profiting, or people working in a mutual aid community and receiving profit in the form of someone else doing work for them when they need it. Well, I guess that's just not true profit. Now, the reason that this was important is because a good half of Radical Reviewer's arguments in this video stem from what I'll just go ahead and assume is a honest misunderstanding of the society voluntarists advocate for, just to give him the benefit of a doubt, and so this response is not 45 minutes long.
Okay, so let's see if capitalism violates this non-aggression principle. Well, capitalism is characterized as private ownership of property, and property is theft, and theft is aggression. Case closed.
If property rights don't exist, then theft isn't a crime because taking someone else's commodities with the intent of depriving the rightful owner of them could only be demonstrably coercive if the person who's having their items taken from them would be able to demonstrate exclusive dominion over them and could also demonstrate that what's being taken is rightfully their property, which of course would mean that property isn't theft. And if property rights exist, then property isn't theft because the would-be thieves don't have any rightful claim over someone else's property because the other person can demonstrate that they have exclusive ownership over it. So, the statement that property is theft is a logical paradox. And I don't even know how many fucking times at this point I've explained that we can demonstrate self-ownership and property rights, so at this point I'm just going to direct anyone who might be asking about it to Shane Killian's video on property rights from first principles. Link will be located in the description.
Okay. Let's look at it a little closer. Private ownership of land is theft.
No, it isn't. People can act upon land and utilize it with their own agency, therefore rightful exclusive ownership over land can be demonstrated. The main issue with Radical Reviewer's arguments, as you're going to see throughout this video, is that he doesn't understand how the burden of proof works, or who the burden of proof lies upon during a dispute like this, to be more specific. Property owners do not have to justify anything that they do with their property or owning property, so long as they aren't directly using their property to initiate force against another person and thereby violate their rights. And even with that being the case, the position the property owner in this situation has to justify isn't that he's owning property, but that he's aggressing upon someone else with that property. This is because the burden of proof always lies on the active position of any conflict, and owning property is a passive position because by owning property you are not acting upon another agent. You're instead simply utilizing something which you created or obtained by trading with someone else, which is demonstrably yours both through ledger and ethically since it's a product of your own agency. The reason that proving a negative is fundamentally fallacious argumentation is because arguments which attempt to do so have an unfalsifiable premise. For example, if you were to be asked, "Why aren't you buying ice cream instead of walking your dog?" You can't respond to this because there's no way that you can justify your actions or invalidate the criticism being presented to you. But this isn't because it's valid criticism, it's because there are an infinite number of things which you aren't doing, and it's impossible for you to try and rationalize why you aren't doing all of them, since many of them are abstractions or just contradict one another, and therefore arguments which assume the burden of proof on a passive position are fundamentally inconsistent.
Let's take a square of land, let's say 50 acres. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's say I want to own this part by the river and build a factory that uses the water. Or maybe I want to privately own this piece of land and cut down the trees to sell for lumber. Now, some problems emerge. 1. What happens to the land has far-reaching implications. Perhaps my riverside factory limits access to water, or pollutes the water.
As noted earlier, it's not possible to demonstrate a rightful claim over someone else's property because their property is an extension of their agency. Also, what Radical Reviewer is proposing to substantiate his argument's premise is not an ethical position, even though the premise of his argument is regarding an ethical question. So this is just a red herring. But taking the substance presented at face value and independently from the context of the argument, is the private ownership of land a bad thing for the environment? Well, no. Firstly, private landowners have the direct incentive to ensure that the condition of their property is as efficacious as possible, especially those who are using the resources on their land to obtain profit and secure their own existence. This is why 83% of the 1.6 billion trees which are planted every year in the United States are planted by logging industries or operated on land which the state doesn't claim ownership over, or why the government has such an atrocious track record with polluting bodies of water. I mean, there's the rivers in India, which are all state-managed, since India's laws reject non-governmental claims of ownership over bodies of water. There's China, same situation. There's Lake Karachay in the Soviet Union, the Chicago Stockyard and Chicago River in the 1850s, the 2015 Gold King mine spill, and those are just a few of the plethora of examples. The reason why state-run organizations or state-managed land have such a terrible track record with pollution is precisely a result of what environmentalist statists seek to accomplish in the first place. As a result of the land not being privately managed, there is no incentive for anyone to maintain the resources on the land, since it's not their land, not their resources, and of no associated cost to them if the land were to become polluted along with the resources diminishing. On top of that, there's absolutely nothing to stop other producers from coming in and trying to harvest the resources. So the only incentive of those who are harvesting resources at this point is to just harvest as much as possible before someone else comes along and takes some of the resources on the land.
Perhaps the deforestation leads to increased landslides and flooding, etc., etc. These impacts are certainly aggressive.
Well, sure, if someone pollutes their land and it directly results in the destruction of someone else's property or victimizes them in some demonstrable way, then that is a clear act of aggression, since there is a clear victim and a clear aggressor. However, this is something which voluntarists have never disputed, so to mention this as some sort of gotcha either demonstrates a clear lack of understanding on the voluntarist position on Radical Reviewers' part, or is intellectual dishonesty on Radical Reviewers' part.
2. You can only do so much with a piece of land. Choosing to do one thing means you can't do another. You can't have a factory, a landfill, a quarry, a school, a parking lot, and a public park occupying the same plot of land.
Says who? What stops someone from having all of these things on their land at once? What if the size of the land they've demonstrated ownership over encompasses enough space that they can do this? What if the factory they build is small or is just a warehouse with a bunch of 3D printers inside? Why can't they just build a building which is big enough to encompass all of these things inside all at once?
This too affects other people, again, perhaps aggressively affecting them.
Yeah, you clearly don't understand how the burden of proof in argumentation works. From now on, I'm just going to skip these fallacious attempts to argue that someone can be victimized by someone else's inaction.
3. By privately owning land which produces profit, I can pass that profit down through the generations, so that each generation increasingly unfairly benefits from my initial theft of the land, as the Morgans and Rockefellers and DuPonts and other family dynasties certainly demonstrate.
Around me are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces.
At this point, the only reason this myth persists is so Marxists can desperately cling on to the notion that class exists, even though assuming this figure was true, it still wouldn't come anywhere near proving that all people of a certain socioeconomic status are secretly conspiring against everyone else, and that depending on socioeconomic status, everyone just falls into one of two different homogeneous hive minds. There are so many issues with the arguments of class and collectivism that it would require an entire video to go over, and indeed, I do have an entire video going over it. But in short, only individuals can be demonstrated to exist, therefore only individuals can act, and they can only act in accordance to their own interests. Now, this isn't to say that more than one individual can't form a group and then share a common interest, but that interest is still a result from the individual's agency and is constructed by individuals for the purpose of attempting to satisfy their own interests in accordance to their own marginal preferences, and sharing enough in common with other individuals that have the similar preferences. They don't all work together because there's some sort of hive mind. And again, here you are making red herrings. What the fuck does any of this have to do with ethical arguments against the non-aggression principle? J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Rothschilds, DuPont, these aren't just rich families, but corporatists and moneylenders who used the state to curb the market through various taxes and market restrictions designed to weed out competitors and to profit off of the debt which the state is forcing onto everyone, and through having the state create usury laws and caps on interest rates. The state could easily just tell these people to sit and spin or even kill them and have their courts rule that their murder was legitimate, but no, the practice of corporatism and the consequent cartelization of industry benefits the state equally, if not more so, than it does the corporatists and moneylenders, which is something that Marxists and so-called collectivist anarchists gravely underestimate, and this is a serious flaw with their conception for how incentives for the state works. Rich people having too much money as being the cause for all of our problems is nothing more than a politically convenient scapegoat, which is why this narrative is parroted all over the mass media. Ultimately, though, the state's interest is simply one thing and one thing only: parasitically funding itself through coercive violence, and it will fucking kill anyone who tries to get in its way. Corporatists and moneylenders are simply unwitting pawns to the state who mutually benefit from its cartelization of the markets and profit from its expansion and militarization. We can see, even with centrally planned economies, governments still operate with the same incentives to expand their influence over society and control how people associate to stop them from trying to trade around the state. Political rule is a result of the state's monopoly on arbitration, because without it, the state wouldn't be able to legally legitimize coercion since there would be competing arbiters. And their murderous incentives come from the fact that governments require theft in order to fund themselves as a result of not having any means to obtain resources otherwise, and they need to constantly keep expanding their influence over society since all government programs operate on an exponential growth curve. And this is exactly what you collectivist quote-unquote anarchists want. You're not radical, you're not even anarchists. There's nothing even remotely liberating or different about the system you advocate for. And this is evidenced by the fact that when an actual militarized worker union forcefully took over the state of Catalonia and implemented an anarcho-syndicalist not a state, the living conditions were comparable to that of the Soviet Union, both materially and how repressed the population's civil liberties were.
Let's take this one step further. Private ownership of the means of production is theft. Okay, so you might grant that property is theft, but what about man-made things like a factory? Certainly that can be privately owned.
How do you define a means of production? Well, according to Marx, a means of production is simply anything that is used to obtain profit, but as mentioned earlier, individuals have different valuations or uses for their own resources, so property can be utilized for more than one function. An example commies like to give a lot is a toothbrush. Okay, well, what if the toothbrush is used to clean someone's house for profit? There's no objective way to define a means of production, even in the example given in this video of a factory. A factory is simply a series of different commodities which on their own can't be used to make profit, and therefore, according to Marx, would not be a means of production, but when utilized in a certain manner can create a factory. Now, is it theft? Well, now we're back at the misplacement of the burden of proof, but his argument goes a bit more in-depth into the surplus value myth in wage labor, which has been debunked time and again, but in short, value is not determined by labor because value is determined by individual marginal preferences, and therefore profit is simply market revenue minus the expense of trading. But even if labor was the determining factor in value, since wage labor is a voluntary association in which you sell your labor to the producer, this would mean that the producer rightfully owns the property which is produced. Now, you can see why I'm not covering much of this video at this point. Not because I can't refute most of these arguments, on the contrary, as I've demonstrated, they're pretty basic. No, it's because it's pretty much the exact same fallacy just being repeated over and over again for 17 straight minutes, and if it's not, then it's some long debunked cliches. In fact, the only bit of this video left that's even remotely relevant to the premise of this video is in this section right here.
Let's look at ANCAPs for a second. So-called anarcho-capitalists often ask,
hey, in your anarcho-communist society, couldn't I make a small area that has capitalism, or would you force me to not be a capitalist?
Which is a valid question because this is precisely where the contradiction in what you're proposing lies. If your system is anarchist, then there are no political rulers, meaning that the individual acts upon their agency and submits to no coercive authority. We've both recognized this, as you've mentioned earlier in your video, and implied by arguing that what you call capitalism is coercive, and that your system is absent of coercion. So if individuals are able to act upon their own agency freely, then they must be able to associate in any manner which they can voluntarily create for themselves with other like-minded and consenting individuals. But more importantly, they must be entitled to the products of their own agency. If your system allows people to freely associate and own the product of their own agency, then it's anarchist but can't be collectivist. If your system would use force against these people to coerce them into associating how you want them to and only using the property the people quote-unquote representing society through the worker council would want them to, then it's collectivist but not anarchist, since the individual is forced to submit to a coercive and centralized political authority which utilizes a monopoly on arbitration to legalize unethical behaviors and criminalize ethical ones.
But this question is flawed on two grounds. One, as I already demonstrated, it is capitalism that is enacting force, with the theft and violence of stealing what is collectively owned and produced in order to privately profit from it. And two, no one would work for you. When I go to work at my minimum wage job, I do so under wage slavery, but not under chattel slavery. If the store I worked for offered chattel slavery or sweatshop conditions as the conditions of work, they'd get laughed out of town. Not because I think I'm better than the people who suffered under those working conditions, but because there has been decades of working class people fighting against capitalism, and they have secured better working conditions. In this same way, no one living in an anarcho-communist society would need to force you not to start a capitalist workplace, because just like how I refuse to work under chattel slavery, no one would work for you.
Well, considering that I spent a better part of this video refuting the first point, I'm simply going to ignore it. As for the second point, well, firstly, if this is how you expect private trade not to exist in a stateless society, then why do you need to initiate force against people in order to stop them from doing so? According to your argument, private trade is a form of coercion, and surely in your society there must be a mechanism to prevent criminals from coercing people. So why, if you simply don't expect people to engage in this form of association, would the legal system in your society actively use force against anyone attempting to engage in this form of association? Secondly, working conditions improve as a result of innovations which occur within the respective industries and due to competition. This is why child labor and workplace fatalities as a result of accidents were declining decades before the New Deal, and why real wage growth was higher throughout the 19th century despite there being no minimum wage laws, a pattern which can still be observed today in countries which have no minimum wage, such as Denmark or Switzerland. Thirdly, the so-called labor rights you're referencing are government restrictions enforced only by coercion and a monopoly on arbitration, and as noted in the second point, have only hindered innovation by artificially increasing the costs of trade, increasing unemployment, and creating artificial scarcity, in turn reducing the standard of living quite significantly. So, what makes you think that people wouldn't seek ways around associating in manners the worker council is forcing them to if they're forcing them to associate in conditions created by the state? And lastly, this argument is based entirely on a snuck assumption that working conditions can only improve as a result of state coercion, but hilariously implies that state coercion would have to exist in your anarchist society, both contradicting the initial premise of this argument and further cementing the fact that you are not an anarchist. It's official. The radical reviewer has sunk to such a low level of fallacious argumentation that he can't help but expose himself with his arguments, which were initially designed to obfuscate and create fallacious conclusions for his position. In short, radical reviewer is just another snooty, arrogant authoritarian whose videos fall as firmly on the Dunning end of the Dunning-Kruger spectrum as he likely does the autism spectrum. Anyway, that's all for today's video. If you liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.
Hey, I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.